My name is Greg Gisvold, and I'm a senior fellow with the Rule of Law Collaborative at the University of South Carolina. For those of you who don't know about us, the Collaborative is a multidisciplinary center based at the university focused on the promotion of the rule of law as a discipline. And we're here today because we have had the honor for the past 8 years of implementing with INL support the Justice Sector Research and Training and Coordination Program. For those of you not familiar with JustTrack, we offer a wide variety of training content to the U.S. interagency community that is focused on justice sector reform. For those of you who are familiar with us, you'll know that in the before times, pre-COVID, we ran a regular series of in-person symposia that focused on emerging and key issues related to the rule of law. Now in our post-COVID online learning world, we've switched to a virtual symposium series. So instead of a single in-person event, which we hope to return to one day, we're going to hold 3 separate events this year, each of which will address an emerging idea, analysis, or tool related to transnational organized crime. This is the first such event. Subsequent to today, we will, in February, have the second in our series, which will highlight a 2-year research effort led by USAID. And in March, our colleagues on JustTrack from the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative will introduce a series of new tools they have developed to assess and program more effectively at the intersection of rule of law, corruption, and organized crime. Today, however, we're going to be hearing about some novel research undertaken for several years by our colleagues at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. They essentially, in a nutshell, sought to disaggregate the monolith we often refer to as organized crime and interrogate available data to understand organized crime rather than one big thing, but as a series of discrete, understandable, identifiable phenomena. And I'm sure, having learned a little bit about this and read their report, it's going to be an interesting discussion. Before we get started, however, let me go over a few logistics that will help us stay on track and cover the range of substance we have planned for today. We are expecting over 100 people, and it is likely that many will continue to join as we get moving. So please, as you join, or if you're on, turn your microphone off. If you are dialing in by phone, please take a moment and figure out how to use your phone to turn the microphone off. We also recommend, just for bandwidth's sake, that you turn your video off. You're not required to, but sometimes it makes things easier. If you end up having trouble hearing, please consider turning on the captions. You'll find them at the bottom of your tab, right next to the raise hand feature. Those can be quite helpful in following along. The slides that we have will be available afterwards, and periodically we will drop links to key documents in the chat box for you to cut, paste, and review later. We hope to have some time for Q&A, but in the interests of everyone on the call, we're going to moderate those. So we are asking, rather than interrupting the flow of dialogue here, you put your questions in the chat box. I will attempt to corral them, marry up the ones that are similar, and pose them to our guests at the appropriate time. You can start doing that as soon as we start the program. There's no need to wait till the end. If you've got a question, just drop it in the chat box. So we've got up on the screen a quick agenda and the names of the folks you'll be speaking from. Let me take a moment here and introduce them briefly. We're honored to hear first from Deputy Assistant Secretary Toby Bradley, who leads the Knowledge Management Office at INL. He's going to draw on a wealth of field-based and diplomatic experience, including having just run INL's office, huge office in Mexico, to provide us with some framing remarks. We're then going to ask Angela Mai from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime to provide us some remarks about how one can use data to understand organized crime and give a brief overview of UNODC's work in this area. Angela is the chief of the Research and Trend Analysis branch at UNODC and an expert in helping developing countries improve their responses to organized crime. Our main presentation today is going to be delivered by Tejal Jesrani, a fellow attorney who has taken a turn away from the practice of law and into the world of development and rule of law. She served as the project manager for Macro, the research effort we're going to hear about today, and it's safe to say has a command of the many, many minute details of the issues we're going to cover. Finally, Christine Klein, Chief of INL's Global Programs and Policy Division, will provide us with some concluding remarks. I, as your friendly master of ceremonies, will be on the lookout for unmuted microphones and collect your questions and pose them to our panel when we near the end. Again, as a reminder, please put your questions in the chat box. You can start doing that as soon as Toby starts speaking. And with last reminder, please again, mute your microphones. Toby, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg, and the entire Just Track team for inviting me to participate in this launch. I'm pleased we're able to continue it in this format, which is very important. It's about transnational organized crime, rule of law, and corruption. These are all critically important topics to the entire U.S. government, but particularly my home bureau, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, or INL. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity periodically to go deep on some of the toughest challenges that are facing law enforcement in our communities. I'm afraid I'm going to go off video because I'm afraid I'm going to freeze up. So I'm going to, but hello. As many of you may know, INL works to keep Americans safe by countering crime, illegal drugs, and instability abroad. It's a mission that we've served for 40 years. To support this mission, our Bureau undertook a self-directed realignment over the past year to become a more strategic, agile, and learning organization that can build on its past experiences. Notable on this effort was that we created a policy planning unit first to seek to know what were our intended results, what is our goal, and why should INL be engaged in it. Next, we created, we wanted to have an ability to then know our actual results against those lofty goals. To do that, we created the Office of Knowledge Management, which has been tasked with guiding our efforts to become a learning organization. And it's designed to ensure that we can, that all of the foreign assistance programs that we implement draw from our 40 years of history, the evidence-based practices that come from elsewhere, and the discussions that are of today that are going on, such as the discussions on race and police reform that we're having in our country. So it's fitting that this office, the Knowledge Management Office, also manages the Just Track program, which since its inception in 2014 has sought to enhance knowledge and skills of justice sector practitioners across the U.S. government by distilling research and lessons learned into training, guidance, and deep dive discussions like these. So those of you who have joined today, I imagine you care about tackling criminal justice challenges, and you are the body of experts or experts in development, let's say, that are seeking to forge those best in class programming that we want to create with this programming that has measurable results, and that we can continually improve upon them because we know those results and we know why we're trying to achieve them. As a bureau that all supports and partners with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC, on a number of efforts around the world, I'm pleased that the Just Track program is shining a spotlight today, really, on UNODC's project, really impressive project on measuring and assessing organized crime in the Western Balkans. It's a great example of partners working together to help inform policy and program outcomes. Through this project, UNODC developed a new framework for a comprehensive assessment of organized crime. It includes 377 qualitative and quantitative indicators to understand the landscape of organized crime in a particular country or region. UNODC's application of this framework to the Western Balkans resulted in a rich collection of organized crime data that offers numerous insights for the region. While these findings are compelling, even more compelling and transferable are UNODC's observations concerning the lack of readily accessible data on organized crime in these countries, and what this tells us about what we, as foreign policy and development assistance professionals, must do to address this problem. As you will hear today in today's presentation, most of the countries UNODC studied lacked adequate or reliable data collection systems to effectively track organized crime. When countries did track this data, the quality and reliability often varied by crime type, showing greater robustness in areas of organized crime that their foreign donors cared about. In some countries, complex or antiquated judicial processes made it difficult to trace cases as they made their way through the system, impeding understanding of which factors led to prosecution or conviction failures. And finally, variability in data collection systems between countries hampered regional information sharing and cooperation. But before we give up, it's not as if the undertaking these types of challenges is what the Knowledge Management Office is about. It's what UNODC and many of us around the table are trying to do. We're trying to continuously do better in these areas and understand what we know and what we don't know. These data availability issues are not unique to the Western Balkans, but instead apply to numerous countries and contexts where organized crime is a concern and poses a threat to the United States and our allies. As Greg mentioned, as a former director of INL office in Mexico, I encountered firsthand how data inaccessibility hampered our ability to assess where investments were likely to succeed and to accurately perceive why some did or did not succeed. In the face of these challenges, my team undertook a complete strategic haul and reassessment of our programs, which included a new approach to collecting data and drawing from that data to address our programming. And at the end of that, it was really a difficult 2-year process. And I stayed 6 years in Mexico, which is unusual for a foreign service officer, partly because I understood that this was not something I could solve in a tour. But I got so passionate about it that I wanted to continue trying, that it was worthwhile to try to set this foundation, which I think this study does, for future work that we can all build on. And that communities of practice like Just Track can continue to learn and can constantly collect and build on. So the first time in Mexico after we did this rehaul, we could actually say our programs were directly linked to reduction in crime and violent incidents. We could see exactly where a prosecutor's office was facing the pain points and not moving cases along, and where justice sector operators were having difficulties implementing Mexico's new accusatory criminal justice system. For the first time, we could really say exactly where the problem was, which affected our programming. So in that sense, as we think about what we're doing, we can't really know the results of our efforts, or we can understand the results of our efforts better if our foreign counterparts know theirs. And again, fortunately, through this project that UNODC is going to talk about today, they've outlined a number of specific, concrete recommendations for how we can provide this much needed support and where we might need to consider conditioning our assistance to countries to both generate and capture the data that we all need. So it means that maybe we don't just go do something in a country, but we actually say, you know what, if we're going to do this, we really need to do programs that are designed to help that country collect and to generate and collect the data that is going to help us understand what the baseline was and how far we came or how far they came. So the results of this program could really have potentially wide-reaching applications. The study is important because it speaks to an old adage: you can't improve what you can't measure. For the U.S. government or the international donor community to effectively confront and combat organized crime, we have to help our foreign partners to strengthen their data collection systems. So to our partners at the University of South Carolina Rule of Law Collaborative, and of course our own J.J. Welling and Greg and the KM team, thank you for organizing and supporting today's event. And of course to Angela and May and our friends at UNODC, thank you for sharing your insights with us. And I am very interested in looking forward to your presentations.
Thanks, Toby, and thank you much for reminding us of the important reality that what gets measured gets done. I'm going to turn the microphone now over to Angela Mai of UNODC.
Hi, Greg, and well, good afternoon here in Vienna to all of you on the other side of Atlantic. So I just wanted to briefly tell you what is UNODC. So UNODC is an organization with headquarters in Vienna, but with many field offices around the world. I'm rephrasing what Toby said in terms of the INL mission to keep Americans safe. Our mission is to keep the world safe from drugs and crime. And so we do a lot of program from international legal framework. We are the custodians of some of the key conventions that help to really address drugs and crime. And for the topic of today, we are really the custodian of the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, a tool that really supports the international cooperation of countries to working together to address organized crime. But what I wanted to emphasize today here, as because I'm dealing with the research, is to emphasize the role that UNODC has in providing knowledge to the international community, to support countries to develop their own knowledge, and to see what are the programs that are effective in terms of fighting drugs and crime, and also to identify trends and threats that relating to drugs and crime, hopefully before we have the harm associated with those threats. So that the topic of today is organized crime, and I want to give you, before giving the word to Tejal, that we'll discuss about the program that we have done in the Balkan countries, to give an overview more in general and give you the flavor of how generally we can look at measure and organized crime. Next slide, please. And so we can measure and analyze organized crime through different lenses. And if you go through the literature, you will see that there are different entry points, if you want, in looking at organized crime. We can look at it in terms of groups. And we can, membership, how many, how they operate, where they are. We can look at the issue of organized crime in terms of markets, we call it, drug markets, or the markets of trafficking in person. That means to look at how, the interaction between the supply, the demand of illicit commodities, but also look at, for example, routes of commodities across countries, across continents. We look at organized in terms of impact. And for you, I guess, in close to Central America, knows very well what is the impact of organized crime, for example, on violence, but also not only on violence, on other issues, on corruption, for example, or economic impact. And we can look at organized crime through the profits, the criminals, so in terms of value of what they get out of organized crime. Or we can look at the criminal justice response and see, in terms of arrests, prosecutions, and convictions. So I just want to give you a flavor in terms of what does it mean if we want to use three lenses to understand organized crime. What kind of data do we need? What kind of characteristics this data needs to have? And I will just give you an example for markets, impact, and criminal profits, because Tejal will cover a lot in terms of groups and criminal justice responses. Next, please. So the first example that I want to give you is an example of looking at the impact. And so if we really want to get the impact and understand the impact of organized crime, we need to, in terms of, and I pick the example, the easy, if you want, the most visible example on violence. Homicide, count of homicide is not enough. We need to have more granular data that can help us to say, for example, in terms of homicide, what is the impact of violence in terms of interpersonal violence? What is in terms of organized crime? And here I just give you an example of when we try to assess regionally from, for example, the example of Europe compared to the Americas in terms of a percentage of homicide that are relating to organized crime. You see that for the Americas, the percentage is much bigger. The great majority of homicide is relating to organized crime, while in Europe, the great majority of homicide are related to interpersonal violence. So, but here the point is to understand, we can do this, we can assess only if the data has the right granularity and the right characteristics. Next one. Another example is the market. So here again, I don't have the time to go through here, but just to make the point, and I give you the example of something that we are studying in terms of wildlife. Here's the market of ivory. If we want to look at the market of an illicit activity, we need to look at different characteristics. In terms of ivory is the, the number of elephants that have been killed, the price, the seizure. And so it's only triangulating this information that we are able to understand if markets are expanding or shrinking. So what kind of data we need if we want to use this lens? We need data on different issues, so not only criminal justice, not only seizure, but we need really this covering 360 degrees, demand, supply, price, only if we have this from different countries, because markets are transnational. And so we need to put together data from different countries. Next one. The other one is an example of the profit. If we want to look at organized through the profits. And here is an example of what we have done, trying to estimate how much money organized crime makes through the trafficking of heroin, through what we call the Balkan route. We estimated that is about 28 billion a year. But to do this, how can we do this? And you see there on the right, just an example. You don't have to look at, but that tells you the idea of the transnational nature that we need on the data in order to come up with the 28 billion. So here the example shows how we need countries to ensure that one of the characteristics that they have in their data is to define where the commodity is coming, where is going, what are they, not only looking at their own country, but also to understand how its own country feature across a region. And so, and here you see the example on how, just to map all the kind of flows that you can have in Europe. Again, to come up with an estimate of profit, you really need this extensive transnational nature of the crime. Next one. Here is an example that bringing it all together, how important is also that organized crime is seen in this entire structure. And here is an example of Mexico. And it's an example of the different levels of issue that we need to look at organized crime. And Tejal will show you a lot about the framework that we have in terms of looking at, for example, groups, activities, enablers, the state response, but also the civil society response to organized crime. And here I don't have the time to go through, but I just wanted to show the red is bad and the green is good. You see that certain states in Mexico, we did this exercise in 2014, and these states in Mexico in 2014 show a very high level of organized crime presence. Next one, what you see between 2014 and 19 is that exactly in those states, between 14 and 19 is where the homicide level most increase in Mexico. So this is just to make the point in terms of data, that is not to collect data for the sake of data, but this is an example on how data that can tell us the presence, where is most acute the problem of organized crime, can be used to prevent. In this case, for example, clearly, the first indication of organized crime in certain states were very much present there before the violence really started to trigger. So that the data are really helpful, would have been, they were helpful at that time to raise the awareness of the authorities that is where to concentrate. So to finish, I want to, next one please. I just wanted to say, okay, what does all of this mean? Well, what is needed? So what is needed is a combination of many things. And you will hear again from Tejal that when we apply all of this, particularly in the Balkan, that one data source alone doesn't tell the whole story. And so we need surveys when we reach the population, we need administrative records, but also we need ad hoc monitoring system, court case analysis. And nowadays I'm really saying where we are investing also a lot as UNODC to look at the big data or preventive analytics to really help us to particularly look forward to understand the threats that are coming. It's important to have both quantitative and qualitative data, and also in a wide range of topics, not only related to crime, because often it's more important actually sometimes to see how crime infiltrate the legal economy. And so it's important also to look at that. But also, as I insist, also the right granularity of the data. And here I cite the International Classification of Crime for statistical purposes, because for you that you are in the United States, it's really important as an instrument that can characterize the type of crime. And I know that the National Academy of Science of the United States has actually recommended indeed the implementation of we call it the ICCS for the United States also statistical system. Then, so how can we achieve this? Well, the key is political will. And not only to collect, to invest on data, but also to share data across countries. But also clearly, in many countries is an issue of technical capacity, but I would say also prioritization of efforts. We need to consider when we talk about organized crime that is not only the national dimension, but it's important to bring the regional and international dimension to what I call connecting the dots. Because if we don't connect the dots, we don't understand really the whole full scale of organized crime. So to finish and to pick up on Toby, what he was saying, and say, how can we help countries and really to also, think about what are the core data that we need in particular to implement and to evaluate later programs. And so to have a core and must-have short list, something that every country can manage, and have maybe a longer list, what I would say nice to have. So, thank you, and over to you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Angela. I have to admit, as a lawyer who fancies himself a bit of a data geek, any presentation that uses the term granularity and multiplicity of sources is near and dear to my heart. Thank you for breaking down both the initial classifications of organized crime and emphasizing the importance of many streams of data to get a holistic picture of the problem. We've put in the chat box several links to UNODC's important work, including most recently the link to the report that Tejal is going to talk about now. And so I'm going to now hand the mic over to Tejal.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening for everybody around the world. I'd also like to say thank you so much to the Rule of Law Collaborative and to INL for inviting UNODC to be part of this symposium. And of course, thank you to Luz for moving the presentation along for me. So you've now heard from Angela about all the different types of analyses and reports and ways to look at organized crime and to analyze it. And so maybe some of you are thinking, like, why do we need another report on organized crime? So, the thinking behind the Measuring and Assessing Organized Crime in the Western Balkans project and the report that came out of the project was that it was hard to tell whether the activities of organized criminal groups were increasing or decreasing over time. And so with the help of quantitative data, it was thought that this analysis might be clarified, and that's what we were trying to do. Next slide, please. So the main goal of the project was to develop and implement a statistical framework to measure organized crime. And the first thing that we wanted to do when we thought about developing this framework was to undertake comprehensive data assessment of the available data that was already there in the Western Balkans that we could pull on to populate our framework and analyze what we wanted to see. So there were several steps that went into this data assessment. First, we divided the concept of organized crime into dimensions that were very much like the dimensions on Angela's slide that we did in Mexico. We divided those dimensions into subdimensions and then into those 377 indicators that were mentioned by Toby. And that became our sort of wish list of data that we then took to all of the jurisdictions in the Western Balkans to talk to them about whether or not this data was available. So we developed assessment tools, we identified our respondents, and then we undertook the data assessment. Next slide, please. So we did the data assessment in November and December of 2017. We interviewed 140 persons in 57 institutions across the Western Balkans. These institutions were the statistical offices, the law enforcement agencies, the public prosecutors, the courts, the prisons. We interviewed customs officials, financial intelligence units, and we then could really understand how to populate the different dimensions of our framework. Next slide, please. So what we found from the data assessment, and you can have a look at the research brief that we wrote really on the data assessment if you want to have more information, but I'll just go through a few main ones right now. What we found was that most countries do not have statistical systems in place to be able to record organized crime. So we split up the concept of organized crime in two dimensions, and two of those dimensions are here on this slide, the dimension of economic value and organized criminal groups. And you can see for economic value that 95% of the indicators that we identified in our framework were not available. For organized criminal groups, we found that 50% were not available and another 43% were not readily available. And when we say not readily available, it meant that the records were stored in hard copy form, that they were in filing cabinets or huge books, registries on the shelf, not in computerized databases that were readily able to be centralized and sent to us or to any other international or regional organization that would ask for them, or readily available for the state itself to analyze organized crime. Next slide, please. We also found that even when data on crime was available, that linkages with organized crime were not available. So these are two graphs that depict our indicators specifically for the courts. And you can see that on the left-hand side for the crime indicators, around a quarter of them are available. But when we talk about organized crime indicators, that available portion shrinks considerably. Next slide, please. So once we had done the data availability assessment, we could then really complete our framework with the understanding of how we would be able to collect all of this data and how we would be able to populate and analyze our different dimensions. So you can see the dimensions at the top. They are state response, enablers, activities, groups, and economic value. And we call this the vertical structure of the framework because then it really drills down into the institutions that we wanted to collect the data from on the left-hand side. You can see law enforcement, prosecutions, courts, prisons, as well as the types of activities that we wanted to collect data on. There's a huge range of them: participation in an organized criminal group, money laundering, drug trafficking, trafficking in persons, migrant smuggling, as well as the enablers of organized crime, obstruction of justice, corruption, ICT facilitated crime. We could also color code the framework to indicate which of the dimensions and subdimensions we would be able to populate with mainly quantitative data, quantitative and qualitative data, or mainly qualitative data. And what I want to point out now is that the groups dimension really necessitated qualitative data to be able to populate, and we got that through interviews, which I'll talk about a bit later. But this was really we would not have had a full framework if we would not have been able to combine the sources of data for this work. Next slide, please. We also talk about the horizontal structure of the framework, and we benefited from a great partnership and coordination with our national institutions on the ground. We had national technical groups in every country and territory that were beneficiaries to the project, and the national technical groups were headed by a focal point who was usually from the statistical office of the country, and they were coordinating the activities of the national technical group and also serving as a focal point for our data collection and input into our data repository that we designed specifically for this project. On the qualitative data side, we had a program of interviews that included prisoners, victims, and migrants, as well as a case law analysis that then helped inform our expert interviews. And in each country, we had a team of field workers who went into the prisons, who went into the migrant centers, and went to the victim services NGOs to interview those specific population groups for the project. Next slide, please. So this is just a slide, outlining the qualitative data collection as a whole. And what I want to focus on here is the prisoners part, that we concentrated on 7 crimes within the prisons. And then going back to the groups part of the framework, we really tried to focus on the modus operandi and the structures of organized criminal groups so that we could populate that part of the framework specifically. Next slide, please. What we also tried to do with our interview tools was to get the same types of information from different populations. So for instance, with migrant smuggling, we asked the migrants and the prisoners that were convicted of smuggling of migrants about the use of violence, about connecting to clients, about travel, about illegal entry, about use of corruption and prices, so that we could triangulate the data, deepen our analysis, as well as get different viewpoints on these different topics from these different populations to really understand their viewpoints on these things. Next slide, please. So when we got all of this data together and we got it back to headquarters and we started looking at it, it was quite a bit of material to analyze, and we had a lot of fun playing with all of it and looking over it and starting to analyze it. We had around 7,000 quantitative observations spanning the time period between 2012 to 2018. We had undertaken case law analysis of 127 organized crime cases involving 323 persons. We had done 72 expert interviews, 95 migrant interviews, 11 victim interviews, and 126 prison interviews altogether. Next slide, please. So we got all this data together, we started analyzing it, we started applying our research questions to it. And the first thing that we really wanted to understand from all of this data, particularly the quantitative data, is how much crime is organized. And so when we looked at it, we found that among all persons convicted for the crimes that were included in our framework, which were 14 crimes, 12% were also convicted of being part of an organized criminal group. Now, when I saw that number, 12%, I was a little bit surprised, I must admit, because I thought that it would be a little bit larger. I thought that because these crimes are typically associated with organized crimes, they're part of the organized crime international framework, that it would be a higher number. There are a couple of reasons, and we can discuss them in the Q&A, why this 12% is the way it is. Most obviously, it is that they are not connected to organized crime, perhaps. Another couple of different reasons why this might be the case is that the structures of organized criminal groups are made so that they really readily detach the lower level echelon offenders and protect the higher echelon structures of the groups, and that lower level offenders have a lot of motivation to deny being part of the organized criminal groups because of the codes of conduct of the groups, as well as the fact that sentencing for being involved as part of a criminal group is much higher. So these types of dynamics might be at play in this number, and I'm sure there are others as well. Next slide, please. We also wanted to understand from our group of crimes whether or not the trends were going up or going down in terms of prosecutions and convictions. And what we found was that over the time period that we looked at, that the prosecutions had increased by 6-fold, while the convictions had decreased by half. And this to us indicated that while the prosecutors and the investigators were preparing cases of organized crime to bring to the courts, for some reason, these cases were not successfully going through the criminal justice system and resulting in convictions. Next slide, please. We also wanted to understand a little bit about whether or not the increased availability of data could result in a better result basically for organized crime. And going back to the data availability assessment, we did actually find in one entity of Bosnia and Herzegovina that they had kept a statistical database on the activities of organized criminal groups that were active in that entity, and that was in Republika Srpska. So we decided to compare the rates of persons arrested for participation in an organized criminal group in two entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and indeed we saw that the rates were much higher in Republika Srpska. Next slide, please. The next thing that we wanted to do was really to further focus in on 4 of the crimes that make up the main illicit markets of organized crime, and where UNODC does a lot of its work, a lot of its technical assistance, a lot of its intergovernmental affairs, and indeed a lot of its research. This was drug production and trafficking, trafficking in persons, trafficking in firearms, and smuggling of migrants. Next slide, please. And so when we focused on these 4 crimes in particular, many important and interesting things came up. So if you look at the top of the slide, you see the top of the iceberg. And you see that within all of the drug production and trafficking crimes, only 5% are linked to organized criminal groups in the Western Balkans. This number becomes a little bit greater when you talk about trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. But then when you go to the donut and you see all of the organized crimes together, you see that this 5% on the top of the iceberg actually turns into 51% of the total, indicating to us that the number of drug production and trafficking crimes in the criminal justice system is just far greater than the number of trafficking in persons crimes. And this helps to us to understand the different representation of these crimes within the criminal justice system. It also is interesting that the numbers of trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants crimes that were linked to organized crime are greater because, and this may be due to the fact that the legal frameworks that are prescribing these crimes include articles and aggravating factors that actually include organized criminal involvement in those crimes. So instead of charging 2 different crimes in the indictment, you only have to charge that one specific article of that legal provision. This may ease the burden for prosecutors to connect organized crimes. Next slide, please. The interview data that we collected really elicited some really interesting things about the structures of organized criminal groups. And what we found was that the structures really depend on the prominent criminal activity in which the group is engaged. So on the left side of the slide, you can see drug trafficking groups. They're really organized in different clusters that correspond to the different phases of the drug trafficking operation. So you can see the wholesale cluster, you can see the retail cluster, you can see the dealers cluster. And a lot of times these clusters were connected through one contact person. And our interviewees had many times said that, they were in touch with one person that was connected to the group, and they didn't even know the name of that person. So this is another example of how, these lower level parts of the groups can be easily detached. On the migrant smuggling side, because migrant smuggling is by definition a transnational organized crime because it crosses borders, we found that bosses were in each country and that they had organizational levels below them to do sort of the operational work in that one specific location. And that the lower level echelon of that group were made up of very specific roles, such as guides, money collectors, accommodation providers, and drivers that were very specified roles. But what we found that they had in common, and I touched on this before, is that these lower level echelons and the prosecutions and convictions really focus on these lower ranks of the criminal organizations, and that these lower ranks can really be easily detached from the rest of the organization to protect the upper echelons of the organized crime group. Next slide, please. From our case law analysis, we were able to construct the profile of a typical organized criminal group member in the Western Balkans. Some of the things that we found were quite expected, such as 96% male. This is consistent with other global data that we have on the gender disaggregation of organized criminal groups. But what we found that was less expected was the age of organized criminals and the fact that they had no previous convictions. 59% had no previous convictions. There's in the academic literature, the initial age of criminal offending is usually thought to be around 10 to 20 years of age. So 48 years of age is quite higher than the average. And there's some thought in this literature that because organized crime requires a higher sophistication, including trans-border connections, as well as deep interactions with the public officials in order to enable the criminal activity through the use of corruption, that these sort of activities are not really able to be carried out by younger criminals and those without that sort of age and sophistication attached. Next slide, please. Our case law analysis also enabled us to cross-reference the size of the group with the structure of the group. So we were able to see that larger groups of 21 to 50 members more often had a network structure, whereas smaller groups with up to 5 members had more often a core group structure, and that mid-sized groups usually had a hierarchical structure. Next slide, please. Through our interviews with migrants and migrant smugglers, we were also able to get a rich amount of data. There was a small surge of migrants crossing through the Western Balkans during the time that we did our field work in late 2018, early 2019. And we saw that 2 different factors really influenced the price of smuggling services, and those were age and origin location. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see that migrants that were 24 or under paid significantly less for migrant smuggling services than those 33 or older. And what we understood from the interview data was that younger migrants make use of online resources and message boards and these sorts of information before they start out on their migration journey, and so that they can negotiate the prices of the smuggling services that they receive and that they pay more frequently than older migrants. We also found that migrants from less peaceful countries ended up paying more for smuggling services than those from more peaceful countries. So you can see in Afghanistan and Syria that the migrants from these countries paid significantly more for the smuggling services. And this is quite straightforward. We can expect that people who feel that their lives are in danger are willing to pay more for smuggling services to get out of these situations. But what's important to understand is that migrant smugglers take advantage of the vulnerability of these migrants to only increase their profits. Next slide, please. We also could do a small analysis on seized and confiscated assets in the Western Balkans, and these are data that are in the context of all criminal activity, so not just related to organized crime, but it still gives some sort of a flavor of the way that criminals use their profits and their disposable incomes. So what we found from this data was that profits are very often invested back into the business. So you can see on the slide agricultural products. There were many entries in the database on fertilizer being bought with being seized, and confiscated, as well as tractors and other sort of agricultural things. Also gambling machines, slot machines, things like that. So that the profits were invested back into the business. We also noticed that, and this was confirmed by the interview data, that criminals very often invested their disposable income in luxury lifestyle items such as fancy phones and fancy cars and fancy vacations and things like this. What we also understood from the expert interviews was that when organized criminals were interested in hiding the illicit origins of their profits, they would very often invest in real property to launder the money. Next slide, please. In terms of the dynamics of trafficking in persons in the Western Balkans during the time period that we looked at, we saw that the numbers of victims, detected victims of trafficking in persons were increasing by threefold, while the convictions dropped by almost half. And what we understood from the interview data with regard to this was that there might be a changing modus operandi with trafficking in persons, whereby women were voluntarily offering themselves to be engaged in the commercial sex market, and that when they decided to end that engagement, that brutal control tactics were being used to continue to exploit them and to continue the access of the traffickers to profits. And this may be then partially explaining the disconnect between the number of detected victims and the number of convictions there that you see. Next slide, please. We also disaggregated the number of convictions of organized crime by gender in the Western Balkans during the time period. And what we found was that 72% of the women convicted for organized crime were also convicted for drug production and trafficking. What was interesting about this was that 16%, and there's a small a mistake in that slide, that the 16% refers to trafficking in firearms, which is interesting to me, would require some follow-up research to really understand what was exactly the involvement of women in trafficking in firearms in the Western Balkans. Next slide, please. So in terms of enablers for organized crime, what we really found from the interview data, and we mainly looked at three different enablers: the use of information and communication technologies, the use of violence, and the use of corruption. And what we found was that really the use of corruption was the central enabler to organized crime in the Western Balkans. And in fact, many criminals said without corruption, organized crime would not exist. So that these, corruption and organized crime are really mutually reinforcing and leading to real systemic weaknesses in the rule of law in the region. We also did a small analysis on cases of public officials that were convicted of corruption in the Western Balkans. And what we found there was that 83% of public officials that were convicted for corruption were convicted for accepting a bribe. Next slide, please. So wrapping it all up, there are really very many policy and operational implications that can come from all of this research. I invite you to look at the full report and also to the research brief on the data assessment to really look at all of those, including in the specific crime types. I'll just, sort of highlight a few here that are very specific to organized crime. And the first one is that increasing the ability to produce and share data specific to organized crime is a crucial step to enhancing the response. And this was really clear from the beginning of the project in the data availability assessment through to the data collection, through to the analysis, that this was really one of the factors that was an obstacle to really understanding organized crime. And there are many practical, as Toby said, steps that countries can take that are outlined in the research brief. Some are easy and cheap to implement. Some require more expense and effort, but yeah, there are some steps that can be taken to increase and share this data. The next one is that successfully making the link between criminal groups and criminal activities is essential for an efficient criminal justice response. And in that sense, I would like to touch on the fact that it might be useful to think about systematizing and really entrenching the use of criminal informants and whistleblower protection in the criminal justice processes of organized crimes, particularly in the Western Balkans, where we see that really the lower echelon offenders are the ones that are being caught and being prosecuted for these crimes in order to get at the higher echelon offenders and organized criminal groups and the heads of the groups. The last one is that while organized crime is applicable to so many different crimes and markets, and it's a wonderful tool to be able to use across the board, sometimes that applicability leads to sort of a diffuse and disperse prevention and combating efforts in the national systems. So the establishment of national interagency bodies dedicated to organized crime could perhaps improve and coordinate the response and make it more efficient overall. In terms of the future possibilities for the framework, we really believe in the possibilities of this framework. We think it's a good addition to other analyses of organized crime, and we hope to be able to apply it in other regions and perhaps even globally. We are doing that right now with elements of it in a national organized crime threat assessment for Nigeria, and we're looking forward to exploring other possibilities in the future on that. That concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tejal. We've gotten a few questions come through, and we are running a little ahead of time. So I'm going to use the power of the chair to do a few questions now before we turn to Christine. And then we'll, after her wrapping remarks, if we can, if we have remaining time, we'll answer some of the other questions. First two that have, or first series that have come in. One, we've got a very sort of targeted question about whether your research revealed trends or patterns in the use of designated non-financial businesses and professions in the money laundering question. And then second, in that same vein, there's a curiosity whether this your data collection and assessment effort had sort of a local effect of creating a market for data. You know, you had a range of interagency collaborators on the ground in your national technical groups, and that touches on the role of political will and cooperation. Can you give us a sense of sort of what the process of pulling this all together, what impact that had locally? So designated non-financial businesses and sort of local impact of the neutral reality of collecting data.
Yeah. Okay. So the first one, the money laundering question, our analysis of money laundering in this project was quite simple. We only collected sort of the basic criminal justice administrative data on cases of money laundering, so investigations, prosecutions, convictions, and we didn't go really into depth on that. I would love to do that in a further research. I think it's really important to really be able to dig into that. Also with regard to corruption, I think these are areas that are extremely necessary in terms of organized crime, but unfortunately we didn't get there this time. In terms of the market for data, yes, I'm a firm believer in the fact that asking questions creates a market for things. So I think a lot of these national institutions didn't really understand the use of this data on organized crime. And I think a lot of times that is the case, that they have, these check marks on the forms, and they don't really understand why am I checking this box or not checking this box until somebody actually asks for that data. And then they really understand, okay, what's the use of this? And they can see then, the analytical reports and things like that and the use of that. So this happened to some degree within the project. In one jurisdiction, it really, we had reports that it really contributed to a greater understanding of the use of this data and the precision in which they could collect and understand it. But yeah, I think there's still a far way to go.
Okay.
Thanks.
We've got two other sort of trends of questions. One focuses on sort of further delineation of your data sets, and whether when you were looking at corruption, did you break down, or when you were looking at different kinds of crime, did you break down the question of corruption, and was it more present than in others? And related to that, the prosecution conviction gap that you mentioned sort of gives rise to the question of whether the cause of that is corruption or something else. can you give us a sense of what the reactions of your local partners were to that, once they saw that gap, and what kind of sort of response ideas came to the fore?
Yeah, definitely. When we saw the prosecution and conviction data, of course, and especially in a region like the Western Balkans, of course, I think the first thing that you think of is corruption. It's a very sensitive area to do research in. We know from our UNODC work that it's been very hard to engage specifically on questions of judicial processes within the corruption cases, specific corruption cases. We would like to move towards that area. I think we are thinking about doing such a sort of case analysis in the Nigeria context, specifically on corruption. But yeah, it's still sort of in this area of corruption research a bit in its infancy. In terms of breaking down organized crime and corruption cases, again, we were not able to get to that in this research. That would be, again, another interesting area, but yeah, we didn't get there this time. Thanks.
Okay. A couple more. And then just as a public reminder to everyone, if you've got a question, feel free to put it in the chat box. I'm going to be fairly rigorous about keeping us on schedule so that everybody gets to meet their other commitments today, and we're not still talking about organized crime at 2 this afternoon. So the 4 main markets that you focused on, were these main by virtue of the data you collected in the Balkans, or are they main by virtue of some other larger data set?
We don't have a larger data set at this point. We only have the Western Balkans data set, but they were the main illicit markets in the Western Balkans. Money laundering also contributed to a small portion of these crimes, but really these were the main illicit crimes. Yeah. And
then lastly, so the sort of a combination question. I think you touched on this with your answer about Nigeria, but the level of granularity, again, my favorite word, is offers a lot of potential for as a baseline for programming. The social profile data of participants and the investment of profits offers an interesting new entry point for deterrence programming. Can you give us an idea of the replicability of this effort? This was obviously the first of its kind. It was bigger than probably most would be, and this is sort of more data collection than a usual like transparency country comparative effort. What are UNODC's plans? Are they evolving? How will this data be available publicly, et cetera? How can we use it?
Yeah. Yes, the data will be available publicly on the website. We have a huge data portal on the website with tons of data. If you haven't had a look at it, please do. It's a great resource, and the Western Balkans data will be put up there at some point as well. In terms of the replicability of the framework, I really hope so. I think that what would be important to start with in thinking about replicating the framework is doing the data availability assessment in whichever way that is possible. We in Nigeria right now, as I mentioned, we have really scaled down the number of indicators that we're looking at. I think we have not 377, more like less than 100. And so we are starting with that number to see whether it is actually doable. And I think that will give us a good idea of what the potentials are in the future. But I really think it does have to do with the data availability. What kind of things that you can get from the administrative sources, what kind of things you would only be able to get from interviews to be able to finish the framework, to complete the analysis and the data collection.
Okay, that's terrific. Thank you. With that, let me remind everyone, feel free to continue to put questions in the chat box, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Christine Klein.
Thank you so much, Greg. Please let me start out by thanking our INL Knowledge Management team for organizing today's session, as well as for our UNODC colleagues for joining us. They are really pioneers in this area and have put forward such a truly significant research effort, which was summarized so well for us by Tejal. The report clearly illustrates that UNODC's statistical framework can help identify specific trends associated with certain crimes and further emphasize the importance of enhancing our capacity building efforts to improve the quality and availability of data, as data collection and analysis continues to pose challenges in many regions. In my work, I attend a lot of multilateral intergovernmental meetings, and in each one, there is a clear and consistent call for more data and better data to help inform policies and programs, both at the national level, but then also internationally. So working to achieve data availability and comparability across borders is very important, and it's proven to be quite a difficult task. To this end, UNODC's macro report is an important contribution to and very much complements the work we do collectively to promote implementation of our anti-crime treaty commitments, namely those enshrined in the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, or the UNTOC, and its 3 protocols on trafficking in persons, smuggling of migrants, and illicit manufacturing and trafficking in firearms, which were all key components of the data sets highlighted by Tejal. For those unfamiliar with the UNTOC, it's the first legally binding global instrument that sets a framework for international cooperation to combat organized crime, requiring states to criminalize core conduct and strengthen mechanisms for mutual legal assistance, extradition, and other areas of international cooperation. So the UNTOC can provide a means to ground multilateral research efforts like those of the macro report. The UNTOC itself has a biannual meeting of states parties where we strive to improve implementation through various lines of efforts. And most recently, in October of 2020, we kicked off a new peer review process. And as part of this, states will undergo a comprehensive assessment to identify challenges and best practices in implementing the UNTOC. Under this effort, there should be opportunities to refocus and directly tie data collection efforts to support implementation of the treaties, with the aim of being a direct benefit to our practitioners so they can better align resources based on trends at the national level. In addition, there are other important efforts at the global level. I wanted to specifically tout something that Angela May referred to, which is the International Classification of Crime Statistics, or the ICCS. As Angela described, this aims to provide a comprehensive framework for crime and criminal justice statistics so that we can understand crime trends at the national and global level. Certainly, the macro report can help inform and bolster these existing data collection platforms. It also, for INL program officers that may be joining us this afternoon or this morning, it could be an important tool and an important area for capacity building efforts, building that capacity at the national level to implement the ICSS. I also wanted to pick up on a theme that Tejal highlighted at the close of her presentation about the link between transnational organized crime and corruption, and how they're mutually reinforcing and both exploit and expand weaknesses in the rule of law. In the multilateral context, this idea of how do you best measure corruption is a perennial challenge. Most recently, in the context of the UN Convention Against Corruption, there was actually an adoption of a resolution on this specific topic. So there is commitment at the global level to deepen our knowledge and understanding. We have longstanding perception indices, but how do we complement that through the type of rigorous data collection that UNODC is undertaking? So certainly something that we hope we can deepen our work with UNODC on in the future. So in sum, informed and reliable data can make all the difference as we explore strategies to combat organized crime, and our efforts are more impactful and productive when they're supported by data. I really want to thank UNODC for their incredible and meaningful work. It's critical for our shared understanding of the best way to combat transnational organized crime. Thank you so much for the opportunity to provide closing remarks, and I'll turn it back to Greg so we can have more conversations and questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. I think you may have been mentally on the same wavelength with some of the folks posing questions, because we got one about we got several about the challenges and limits of using locally collected data. And so Tejal and Angela, I'll throw this open to either of you. The question sort of relates to sort of three levels of concern. One, were there limitations on this data, given that you're the UN? Were you required to only rely on member state data, or could you use and should you use NGO or academic data, either in triangulation or supplement? And what were the challenges in using data across jurisdictions, especially related to what Christine was talking about with ICCS, and whether, Albania classifies this kind of crime this way and Bosnia takes it another way? And I've got a few more after that one. So I'll let you puzzle over those three, and then we'll keep pushing forward.
Hi, I don't know who wants to start. Tejal, do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'll address the question of the data from NGO and member states. Because here we always think about what is the purpose of the data collection. So when we work as an institution, as UNODC, we want the data to be actually used for change. And so for change in terms of, government action with that data. And so we've seen when we go to countries that we need to do this together with government. Otherwise, government, look differently if data are produced by other actors. And so with, if you want sometime pain, because they are always challenging when you go through certain institutions, but we have achieved a great result. I just want to tell you, for example, we have done 2 corruption surveys with the Nigerian National Statistical Office. And I have to tell you that at the beginning, the Nigerian Statistical Office was even threatened by the police and by the justice system not to publish the data. But, with our support and so on, so we were confident. And so now we have embedded into a national process something to monitor corruption by the government. And I can tell you that the government acted upon those results that would not have acted if that would have come from an NGOs. This doesn't mean that NGOs' involvement is not important. And the example of the Balkan, but in other studies that we have done around the world, we use also NGOs to reach those the government would not reach. If you want to interview victims, if you wanted to have, to reach that level of qualitative knowledge, then I think NGO, and by the way, and by all means, not all data and information is for government use. There is a value also for data for advocacy to be used by NGOs. But then NGO can produce data for advocacy. Then last point on the how to ensure that there is comparability. And I'm glad to Christine picking up on the ICCS, because to me, that is the great step that we have done at international level. And for those of you that are lawyers, more into criminal justice institution and so on, I just want to tell you that classification is not built on criminal justice system, because as you well know, we could not do something at international level, because the way how an offense is treated in a country is very different on the same thing that may be treated in other countries. So we have built this classification based on behavioral activities. And so, we have a classification of killings. And then whether in some countries dowry-related deaths may be considered an homicide or not, but for the international classification is an intentional killings. And so in that way, we are able to compare countries. But the biggest, I think, effort and what the classification gives is the characterization of crime, and it's the granularity, Greg, that we are picking up on this call. That is so important, because the classification gives the model that for a criminal justice institution, not just to list crime. So it's not just to list how many homicide we had, but is to characterize that homicide in terms of who did it, what was the relationship between the victims and perpetrator, was in the context of organized crime. That helps us really to use the data for changing policy.
Okay, terrific. So our last, I'm going to combine a couple of questions and make them a little more targeted, and then I'll turn the mic over to JJ for some to close us out. There are several questions about the data quality assessment process that you went through before beginning macro and the big collection effort, and they kind of divide up into two sides. One, help us understand the sort of the human side of your data collection, data assessment, and quality effort. You know, what kind of capacity building did you see, or did that analysis tell you was needed? Were there common weaknesses? Are they consistent with other national data collection efforts like the World Bank? You know, what can we learn about how to strengthen and where to start strengthening national data systems? And then related to the logistics, you know, looking at the data quality assessment in its own right as a useful pre-programming assessment, how long did that take? What did it cost? You know, are there smaller scale options for digging into that, you know, sort of capacity realm before you get to what it tells you when you can do it well? If that makes sense.
Yes. I'll try to get to some of them. I'm not sure if I can cover all of it, but they're all really great questions.
And you have 2 minutes.
Really, exactly. They're all really great questions. But I also wanted to say, in reference to the sort of harmonization of the data across, it really helped that a lot of these countries in the Western Balkans were at one time one country. So they all had really consistent data collection structures already in place. They used the same categories for data collection in most of the countries. So this was really lucky for us. If you wanted to do it in a different region, I think it would probably be a little more difficult, but that's why the data assessment is so important. And that's why it needs to be a conversation. You need to go in or by means of phone or by means of video conference, just say like, this is what we want. What do you have? And then really have a conversation about what you want matches up with what is available. So that, you know, and that's what we are hoping also to do in Nigeria now, is to actually have data collection be more of a discussion so that we can see the basis of where people are, where they want to get to, but what we can already use right now to analyze the situation. In terms of easy fixes, yeah, there were a ton. There's this. I don't think we have it in the U.S., but there's something called the principal offense rule, where if there are many charges in the indictment, only the most serious charge goes into the computerized database. So if there's more than one charge, it just doesn't get saved into the thing, and it falls down. So you just don't get that in the analysis of the data. This could be very easily fixed by the use of the disaggregation links in the ICCS, the organized crime link there, and to implement that. And it helped also that a lot of these countries were considering EU involvement and going into the EU. And so they were interested in implementing ICCS and in harmonizing their data in that way. Thanks.
Terrific. I think suffice it to say that you've opened up a programmatic can of worms with your both your data analysis, with the highlight that macro throws on national data systems and when they do and when they don't work, and the importance of granular data in better programming. So kudos. You've made more work for us all and smoothed it along at the same time. Let me extend my personal thanks to Jal, to you, Angela, Christine, and Toby for your efforts today and for some scintillating presentations. And I will turn it over to JJ to close us out.
Thank you, Greg. And on behalf of the Just Track Plus program, INL, we do want to reiterate, and the Office of Knowledge Management, we want to reiterate our gratitude to you, Greg, for moderating and helping organize today's event, as well as your colleagues from the University of South Carolina Rule of Law Collaborative. Of course, to Angela and Tajal for their wonderful presentations and for helping us really hone in on these critical issues that help us think and rethink sort of how we are doing our foreign assistance to address organized crime. And of course, to Christine Klein from our Office of Global Programs and Policy, thank you for really helping us kind of tie these issues together and put them in the context of our multilateral policy work. So thank you, and thank you to all of you who have joined us for this fascinating discussion. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please do join us for future Just Track Plus events, including the remaining 2 webinars in this particular series. So we'll be sharing more information shortly on the timing of our next event featuring USAID's research in these areas, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks so much, and please visit the Just Track website for the slides from today's presentation. These will be posted shortly. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.